snow had arrived in the small hours before dawn, settling over the village of St. Mary Mead with the quiet thoroughness of a well-trained housemaid. Every thatched roof bore its pristine white burden, every garden gate wore a delicate cap of frost, and the ancient churchyard elms stood sentinel in their winter finery, their bare branches etched against a pearl-grey sky. From the bell tower of St. Bartholomew's, the Christmas morning chimes rang out across the hushed landscape, calling the faithful to worship with a clarity that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen scarf as she made her careful way along the frost-slicked path, her walking stick tapping a gentle rhythm against the stones. At 74, she had witnessed enough Christmas mornings in St. Mary Mead to know that beneath the season's promise of peace and goodwill, human nature remained as complex and unpredictable as ever. Indeed, she had often observed that the holidays had a peculiar way of bringing both the best and the most troublesome aspects of people's characters to the surface, like sediment stirred up in what had appeared to be clear water. The church was fuller than usual for morning service, with even the most irregular attendees making their annual appearance. Miss Marple settled into her customary pew and allowed her keen blue eyes to wander over the familiar faces with the gentle attention of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the intricate patterns of village life. There was Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the village physician, sitting rather stiffly beside his wife Margaret, whose pinched expression suggested that their morning had not begun harmoniously. Young Timothy Hartwell, the doctor's nephew and apprentice, fidgeted in the pew behind them, clearly uncomfortable in his formal attire. In the front pew sat Colonel Reginald Weatherby, a man whose military bearing remained as rigid as his opinions, even in retirement. His presence commanded attention, as it always had, though Miss Marple noted with interest that his usual companion, his housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Crane, was conspicuously absent. Mrs. Weatherby, the colonel's wife of 30 years, sat beside him with the patient expression of a woman long accustomed to her husband's demanding nature, though her gloved hands twisted nervously in her lap. The Reverend Peter Clement's voice resonated through the ancient stone walls as he spoke of peace on earth and goodwill toward men, but Miss Marple found her attention drawn to the subtle undercurrents of tension that seemed to flow beneath the familiar Christmas rituals. She observed how Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell avoided her husband's gaze, how young Timothy's eyes kept darting toward the stained glass windows as if seeking escape, and how Colonel Weatherby's jaw was set in the particular way that suggested he was suppressing considerable irritation about something. As the final hymn concluded and the congregation began to file out into the bright morning sunshine, Miss Marple lingered, allowing others to pass while she gathered her things with deliberate care. The colonel, she noticed, was among the first to leave, his military stride carrying him quickly down the aisle despite his 78 years. Mrs. Weatherby followed at a more measured pace, pausing to exchange pleasantries with several neighbors, though her smile seemed somewhat forced. The crisp air outside carried the mingled scents of wood smoke and snow, and voices were hushed by the white blanket that muffled all sound. Miss Marple had just reached the lich gate when the peaceful morning was shattered by a sound that made her blood run cold. A woman's scream, high and sharp with terror, coming from the direction of Weatherby House. Mrs. Crane, the colonel's housekeeper, came running down the lane, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her face white with shock. "Help!" she cried, her voice carrying across the churchyard. "Oh, please, someone help! It's the colonel! Something terrible has happened!" Dr. Hartwell was the first to respond, his medical training overriding any personal considerations as he hurried toward the house. Several other villagers followed, their Christmas morning serenity replaced by urgent concern. Miss Marple, though she moved more slowly than the others, felt her pulse quicken with a familiar sense of foreboding. In her long experience, such disruptions to the natural order rarely proved to be simple accidents. Weatherby House stood at the end of a tree-lined drive, its Georgian facade as imposing as its owner had been in life. The front door stood open, and through it came the sound of Dr. Hartwell's voice, professional and grave. Miss Marple arrived to find a small crowd gathered in the entrance hall, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, curiosity, and that peculiar excitement that accompanies unexpected drama. Colonel Weatherby lay in his study, slumped over his mahogany desk in a position that spoke of sudden collapse. His morning correspondence lay scattered across the leather surface, and his fountain pen had rolled to the floor, leaving a small trail of blue ink across the Persian carpet. But it was not the scene of a simple heart attack or stroke, as Dr. Hartwell's grim expression quickly made clear. "He's been poisoned," the doctor announced quietly, his voice carrying the weight of professional certainty. "The smell is unmistakable. Bitter almonds. Cyanide, I believe." Miss Marple positioned herself near the doorway, where she could observe both the scene and the reactions of those around her. Already, she noted, the human drama was beginning to unfold in patterns as predictable as they were revealing. Mrs. Weatherby stood frozen by the window, her face a mask of shock that might have concealed any number of emotions. Mrs. Crane wept openly, her grief appearing genuine, though Miss Marple had learned long ago that appearances could be thoroughly deceiving. Young Timothy Hartwell had gone quite pale and seemed unable to look directly at the body, while his uncle maintained the professional composure expected of a country physician. What caught Miss Marple's particular attention, however, was a small detail that others had overlooked in the immediate shock of discovery. On the desk beside the Colonel's morning teacup, a delicate spode china piece that she knew he favored, lay a single sprig of mistletoe, its white berries gleaming like tiny pearls against the dark wood. It seemed an oddly festive touch in such a grim scene, and Miss Marple filed the observation away with the careful attention she had learned to give to seemingly insignificant details. The peaceful Christmas morning in St. Mary Mead had become something far more sinister, and as the sound of approaching police sirens began to penetrate the winter silence, Miss Marple settled in to observe human nature reveal itself in all its complicated and dangerous complexity. The season of goodwill, it seemed, had harbored considerably darker intentions than anyone might have expected. The sound of motor cars crunching over the frozen gravel announced the arrival of officialdom to Weatherby House, their engines cutting through the crystalline morning air with mechanical precision. Inspector Slack emerged from the lead vehicle with his characteristic blend of professional efficiency and barely concealed irritation at having his Christmas morning disrupted by yet another village murder. A lean man with sharp features and an economy of movement that spoke to years of police work, he surveyed the assembled villagers with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read guilt and innocence in the subtle arrangements of human behavior. Right then, Inspector Slack announced, his voice carrying across the entrance hall with unmistakable authority. "I'll want everyone who was present at the discovery to remain available for questioning. The rest of you can return to your Christmas dinners, but don't think of leaving the village without informing the constabulary." His gaze swept over the crowd with the methodical attention of a man cataloguing faces for future reference. Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, his medical bag still in hand, his professional demeanor intact despite the shocking circumstances. "Inspector, I've made a preliminary examination. The deceased shows clear signs of cyanide poisoning. The distinctive odor, the facial coloration, the rapid onset. Death would have occurred within minutes of ingestion." Miss Marple, positioning herself near the morning room doorway where she could observe without appearing intrusive, noted with interest how Inspector Slack's attention immediately focused on the practical details of the crime scene. He moved into the study with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that first impressions often proved crucial to solving cases, his eyes taking in every element of the tableau before him. The Colonel's body remained slumped over his mahogany desk, the morning correspondence scattered across its leather surface in a pattern that suggested sudden collapse. The teacup, half empty and positioned slightly off-center from where a man of the Colonel's precise habits would normally place it, drew the inspector's particular attention. Miss Marple observed him noting the small details that others had overlooked, the way the sugar tongs lay at an odd angle, their silver surface bearing the faint dampness of recent cleaning, and the curious positioning of the sprig of mistletoe, so incongruous against the study's masculine severity. "Mrs. Crane," Inspector Slack said, turning to the housekeeper who stood wringing her hands near the doorway, "I'll need you to walk me through exactly what happened this morning, step by step." Dorothy Crane drew herself up with visible effort, her voice trembling but determined. "I arrived at 7 o'clock as usual, Inspector. The Colonel always liked his routine maintained, even on holidays. I prepared his morning tea, Earl Grey, 1 sugar, no milk, just as I have every morning for the past 11 years. When I brought it to his study at 8:30, I found him just as you see him now." Inspector Slack made careful notes, his pencil scratching against the paper with mechanical regularity. "Was the study door locked when you arrived?" "No, sir. It was closed but not locked, which struck me as unusual. The Colonel was most particular about security, especially in the evenings. He always locked his study before retiring." This detail caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. In her long experience observing human nature, she had learned that deviations from established routines often held the key to understanding criminal behavior. A man like Colonel Weatherby, with his military precision and attention to detail, would not have left his study unlocked without compelling reason. The questioning continued with methodical thoroughness as Inspector Slack established the basic timeline of events. Mrs. Weatherby, when called to give her statement, maintained her composure with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations. She confirmed that she had last seen her husband around 9 o'clock the previous evening when he had retired to his study to attend to correspondence. "We had words yesterday afternoon," she admitted with visible reluctance, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. "A disagreement about a rather personal matter. I thought it best to allow him time to reflect before attempting any reconciliation." Young Timothy Hartwell, clearly uncomfortable with the attention focused upon him, provided what proved to be a crucial piece of information. "I was walking back from the village last night, rather late. Must have been near 11 o'clock. And I noticed lights still burning in the Colonel's study windows. It seemed unusual for him to be working so late on Christmas Eve." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose with interest. "The Lamb and Flag, was it? Rather late for Christmas Eve celebrations." Timothy's face reddened with embarrassment. "Some friends had come down from London for the holidays. We may have lingered longer than was strictly appropriate." Dr. Hartwell's expression suggested he was less than pleased with his nephew's admission, but Miss Marple found herself more intrigued by the implications of the timing. If the Colonel had been alive and active at 11 o'clock, yet Mrs. Crane had found him dead at 8:30 the following morning, it suggested the poison had been administered sometime during the night or very early morning hours. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple quietly excused herself to examine the exterior of the house, ostensibly for a breath of fresh air, but actually to observe details that others might have overlooked. The snow that had seemed so festive during the morning service now served a more practical purpose, preserving evidence of any nocturnal visitors to Weatherby House. Walking carefully around the building's perimeter, she discovered that the study's French doors, which opened onto the garden, showed clear signs of recent disturbance. The snow immediately in front of them had been trampled, and though the continuing snowfall had obscured specific details, the pattern suggested someone had approached from the garden during the night. More significantly, when she tested the door handles, she found them unlocked, a detail that would have been unthinkable for a man as security-conscious as Colonel Weatherby. Meanwhile, the news of the Colonel's murder spread through St. Mary Mead with the inexorable efficiency of village gossip. At the post office, Mrs. Pratt held court over the morning's revelations, her voice dropping to conspiratorial whispers as she shared her theories with anyone willing to listen. "Poison, they're saying. Cyanide, no less. Who would have thought such a thing could happen here, and on Christmas morning?" The reaction among the villagers revealed the complex web of relationships that had surrounded the deceased. While some, like the vicar's wife, expressed genuine sorrow at the tragedy, Others betrayed a flicker of grim satisfaction, as if the colonel's demise represented a kind of cosmic justice for his years of autocratic behavior. Miss Marple, observing these reactions with her characteristic attention to human nature, noted how quickly people began constructing narratives that fit their existing prejudices and resentments. Old Mr. Petherick, the retired solicitor, voiced what many were thinking when he muttered to his companion at the churchyard gate. Always said Weatherby would come to a bad end. Too many enemies, that man. Sharp tongue and a harder heart. Bound to catch up with him eventually. The theories circulating among the villagers ranged from the practical to the fantastical. Some suggested financial motives, pointing to rumors of failed investments and business disputes. Others focused on personal grievances, recalling the colonel's numerous conflicts with neighbors over property boundaries, his opposition to village improvements, and his general reputation for making enemies wherever he went. But Miss Marple found herself returning repeatedly to the image of that incongruous sprig of mistletoe, so carefully placed beside the poisoned teacup. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that such symbolic gestures rarely occurred by accident. Someone had wanted that mistletoe to be found, had intended it to convey a specific message. The question was, what message and to whom? As Inspector Slack concluded his initial interviews and began the process of securing the scene for more detailed forensic examination, Miss Marple made her way quietly back to her cottage, her mind already working through the various possibilities presented by the morning's revelations. The murder of Colonel Weatherby was clearly more complex than it appeared on the surface, involving not just the mechanics of poison administration, but an intricate web of relationships, secrets, and long-held grievances that would require careful unraveling. The peaceful Christmas morning in St. Mary Mead had been shattered by violence, but Miss Marple understood that the real work of detection was only just beginning. In the coming days, as Inspector Slack pursued his methodical investigation, she would continue her own quiet observations, watching for those small revelations of human nature that often proved more valuable than any physical evidence in solving the most perplexing crimes. The afternoon brought an unusual atmosphere to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself had drawn breath and held it. Christmas dinners sat cooling on sideboards, while neighbors gathered in small clusters along the lanes, their voices carrying that peculiar mixture of shock and fascination that accompanies sudden tragedy. The peaceful rhythm of the holiday had been shattered, replaced by something far more sinister, and the residents found themselves studying familiar faces with new and uncomfortable scrutiny. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the investigation proceeded with the grinding efficiency of official procedure. He had established a timeline that placed the poisoning sometime between 11 o'clock the previous evening, when young Timothy Hartwell had observed lights burning in the colonel's study, and 7:30 that morning, when Mrs. Crane had prepared the fatal cup of tea. The forensic team from the county town worked with clinical precision, photographing every detail of the study and carefully bagging potential evidence, including the incongruous sprig of mistletoe that continued to puzzle both the inspector and Miss Marple. At the village post office, Mrs. Pratt held court over the morning's revelations, dispensing theories along with the afternoon mail. The gathered villagers offered their own interpretations of events, each colored by years of accumulated grievances and observations. Colonel Weatherby, it emerged through their collective memory, had been a man who inspired strong feelings in all directions, respected for his military service and social position, but resented for his autocratic manner and sharp tongue. "Mark my words," declared Mrs. Price Ridley with the authority of someone who had appointed herself the village's unofficial chronicler of scandal. "There's more to this than meets the eye. The colonel had his fingers in too many pies, if you ask me. All those business dealings, all those arguments about money and property, someone finally decided they'd had enough of his interference." Miss Marple, who had ventured out ostensibly to collect a parcel but actually to observe the community's reaction, listened with the patient attention she reserved for studying human nature in its various manifestations. She noted how Dr. Hartwell, when he appeared briefly at the post office, moved with the careful precision of a man under considerable strain. His usual professional composure seemed forced, and there was something in his manner that suggested anxiety extending far beyond his medical duties to the deceased. The most significant development came when Inspector Slack returned to the Hartwell surgery for a more thorough examination of the medical supplies. Dr. Hartwell stood with military straightness as the inspector methodically checked his poison cabinet, each bottle accounted for and properly logged. The cyanide, used occasionally for laboratory demonstrations, remained at its expected level, offering no obvious source for the murder weapon. "I maintain strict records," Dr. Hartwell said, his voice carrying the defensive tone of a conscientious professional. "Every substance is accounted for, every use documented. You'll find everything in order." Young Timothy, cleaning instruments in the adjoining room with unnecessary thoroughness, struggled with an internal battle that showed clearly in his pale face and trembling hands. In his pocket, weighing heavier with each passing hour, was an envelope that had arrived the previous day. A letter from Colonel Weatherby, written in the crisp, unforgiving hand that had commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the village. The letter, when Timothy finally forced himself to read it in the privacy of the surgery's back room, contained exactly what he had feared. "I will speak to your uncle after the holidays regarding your recent difficulties. The debts you have accumulated in London cannot continue to be overlooked. Consider this your final warning before I am obliged to take more decisive action." The words struck him like a physical blow. The Colonel's threat to expose his gambling debts to Uncle Geoffrey represented not merely financial ruin, but complete social disgrace. His uncle had already expressed concern about Timothy's behavior, and revelation of the true extent of his London escapades would mean the end of his medical apprenticeship and any hope of a respectable future. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had made her way to Weatherby House, under the pretext of offering assistance to Mrs. Crane. The housekeeper, still shaken by the morning's discovery, welcomed the company with pathetic gratitude. As they sat in the morning room, away from the bustle of the police investigation, Miss Marple gently drew out details that painted a clearer picture of the Colonel's final hours. The tea service was prepared exactly as always, Mrs. Crane explained, her voice still unsteady. "I laid the tray at 7 o'clock sharp, just as I have every morning for 11 years. But when I brought it to his study at 8:30, she shuddered, unable to complete the sentence. Miss Marple noted with interest that the teacup, when Mrs. Crane had discovered it, had been cold despite the tea having been freshly brewed. This suggested either that the Colonel had allowed it to sit untouched for some time, or that the poison had been introduced after the tea had cooled, a detail that might prove significant in determining exactly when and how the crime had been committed. "The French doors," Miss Marple observed gently. "Mrs. Crane mentioned they were found unlocked this morning." The housekeeper's face flushed with distress. "Yes, miss, and I can't account for it. The Colonel was most particular about security. He would never have left those doors unlocked, especially not in winter. But there they were, and the study so cold you could see your breath." This detail reinforced Miss Marple's growing conviction that the murder had involved someone with intimate knowledge of the household routines and access to the Colonel's private study. The unlocked doors suggested not forced entry, but rather an invitation, or at least an expectation of a visitor who would need alternative access to the house. The afternoon brought another significant revelation when Inspector Slack discovered correspondence in the Colonel's desk indicating a scheduled meeting with Mr. Petherick, the village solicitor, for the day after Boxing Day. The purpose, according to the lawyer's formal note, was to discuss testamentary dispositions. In plainer terms, changes to the Colonel's will. This news, when it inevitably leaked through the village's efficient gossip network, added a new dimension to the speculation surrounding the murder. Mrs. Weatherby, When questioned about the proposed changes, maintained her composure with visible effort, insisting that her husband's business affairs were his own concern. But her carefully controlled responses suggested that the potential alteration of the will was a matter of considerable significance to the household. As evening approached and the short winter day faded into twilight, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads of motive and opportunity that were beginning to emerge. The Colonel had been a man who accumulated enemies as readily as he had accumulated property and influence. His rigid control over household finances, his interference in village affairs, his tendency to use his knowledge of others' weaknesses as leverage. All of these characteristics had created a web of resentment that extended throughout the community. Yet the method of murder, poison administered in the privacy of his study, with that symbolic sprig of mistletoe left as a calling card, suggested something more personal than simple revenge. This was a crime that spoke to intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and psychology, committed by someone who wanted not merely to kill, but to make a statement in the process. The question that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as she prepared for bed was not simply who had possessed the means and opportunity to poison Colonel Weatherby, but who had felt compelled to do so in such a deliberate and symbolic manner. The answer, she suspected, lay not in the mechanical details of poison administration, but in the complex emotional landscape of a small village where secrets and resentments had been allowed to fester beneath the surface of respectability for far too long. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new questions, and perhaps the beginning of answers that would expose the darker currents flowing beneath St. Mary Mead's peaceful facade. The Christmas season, with its emphasis on forgiveness and goodwill, had instead become the backdrop for a crime that spoke to the most dangerous aspects of human nature, the capacity for calculated revenge disguised as righteous justice. Boxing Day dawned with the peculiar quality of light that follows fresh snow, bright yet somehow muted, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton wool. The village of St. Mary Mead stirred reluctantly from its holiday stupor, the peaceful rhythms of Christmas giving way to the more urgent business of murder investigation. Inspector Slack arrived at Weatherby House before 8 o'clock, his motor car cutting fresh tracks through the pristine snow as he prepared to delve deeper into the web of secrets that had culminated in Colonel Weatherby's death. The physical evidence speaks. The inspector's methodical examination of the crime scene revealed details that had been overlooked in the initial shock of discovery. In the kitchen, Mrs. Crane demonstrated the precise ritual of the Colonel's morning tea preparation with the mechanical precision of 11 years' practice. But when Inspector Slack examined the sugar tin from which she had drawn the Colonel's customary single lump, he noticed something that made him pause, a faint dusting of crystals around the rim, evidence of hurried or careless handling. "I always level the spoon with a knife," Mrs. Crane insisted, her voice carrying the defensive pride of a conscientious housekeeper. "It isn't me that spilled, sir." Miss Marple, who had arrived under the pretext of offering comfort to the bereaved household, observed this exchange with particular interest. The sugar spillage suggested that someone unfamiliar with the kitchen's routines had handled the tin, someone whose movements lacked the practiced economy of the regular staff. More intriguing still was Inspector Slack's discovery in the study itself. The bell pull beside the Colonel's desk showed a fresh crease in its fabric, a sharp interruption in the cord's natural drape that suggested it had been yanked with considerable force. If the Colonel had felt himself succumbing to poison, he might have attempted to summon help, yet no one had responded to any such call. The teacup presented its own puzzle. Dr. Hartwell's medical examination had confirmed that cyanide acts with terrifying swiftness, yet Mrs. Crane's testimony placed the tea's preparation at 7 o'clock and its delivery at 8:30. Miss Marple, drawing upon her extensive experience with domestic routines, noted that tea left standing for such a period would have formed a distinct skin on its surface. The cup found beside the Colonel's body showed no such film, suggesting he had drunk from it much closer to the time of his death. Secrets in the household. The investigation took a more personal turn when Mrs. Crane, her composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated guilt, sought out Miss Marple at her cottage. The housekeeper's distress was genuine, but beneath her grief lay something more troubling, the burden of secrets she had been paid to keep. "There were things I saw, things I heard," Mrs. Crane confessed, her voice breaking as she sat in Miss Marple's comfortable parlor. "The Colonel wasn't always the gentleman he appeared to be in public. There were visitors who came through the garden entrance, correspondence that was never to be posted, financial matters that didn't bear close examination." Most significantly, Mrs. Crane revealed a heated argument she had witnessed between Colonel Weatherby and Dr. Hartwell just 3 days before Christmas. The two men had met in the study, their voices raised despite attempts at discretion, with the colonel threatening to expose some professional misconduct involving medical supplies, and the doctor leaving in a state of barely controlled fury. This revelation cast Dr. Hartwell's nervous behavior during questioning in an entirely new light. His defensive attitude when Inspector Slack had examined his poison cabinet, his carefully rehearsed account of his movements on Christmas Eve, and the obvious strain that marked his every interaction with the police all suggested a man with compelling reasons to fear exposure. The case against Timothy. Meanwhile, young Timothy Hartwell found himself increasingly isolated by circumstance and his own guilty knowledge. The letter from Colonel Weatherby seemed to burn in his pocket like a physical accusation, its threat to expose his gambling debts growing more terrifying with each passing hour. His uncle, suspicious glances suggested that Dr. Hartwell was beginning to suspect Timothy knew more about recent events than he had admitted. Inspector Slack, following the logical progression of motive and opportunity, began to focus his attention on the young man with increasing intensity. Timothy's financial difficulties provided clear motive. His late return from the Lamb and Flag on Christmas Eve established opportunity, and his obvious nervousness suggested consciousness of guilt. The village, hungry for explanations and eager to assign blame, began to coalesce around the theory of Timothy's culpability with the efficiency that marks small communities confronted by scandal. The physical evidence seemed to support this theory. Footprints in the snow beneath the study's French doors indicated that someone of lighter build had entered and departed through the garden, someone who might easily match Timothy's slight frame. The unlocked doors suggested either panic or inexperience, qualities that fit perfectly with the image of a desperate young man driven to murder by mounting debts and threats of exposure. Village undercurrents. The investigation's progress was accompanied by the inevitable chorus of village gossip, with Mrs. Pratt holding court at the post office and theories proliferating with each telling. The revelation of Timothy's gambling debts spread through St. Mary Mead with viral efficiency, creating a narrative that satisfied the community's need for understanding while confirming their suspicions about the dangers of youthful excess. "Always said that boy would come to no good," declared Mrs. Price Ridley with the satisfaction of someone whose dire predictions had apparently been vindicated. Gambling debts and London friends. What could one expect? Yet beneath the surface consensus, more thoughtful observers noted troubling inconsistencies. The mistletoe sprig, with its carefully tied ribbon and symbolic placement, suggested a level of calculation that seemed inconsistent with a panicked young man's desperate act. The precision required to administer poison in exactly the right dose, at exactly the right moment, spoke to knowledge and planning that exceeded Timothy's demonstrated capabilities. Miss Marple's growing doubts. While Inspector Slack pursued his methodical investigation and the village settled into comfortable certainty about Timothy's guilt, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that didn't quite fit the emerging narrative. Her long experience with human nature had taught her to distrust solutions that appeared too neat, too perfectly aligned with community prejudices and expectations. The sprig of mistletoe continued to intrigue her particularly. Someone had taken considerable care in its selection and placement, choosing a symbol traditionally associated with peace and goodwill as an ironic commentary on Christmas morning murder. This suggested not merely practical calculation, but a kind of bitter poetry that spoke to deeper emotional currents than simple financial desperation. More puzzling still was the matter of the grey gloves mentioned by Mr. Larcher, the greengrocer who had sold mistletoe on Christmas Eve. His description of a quiet woman who paid in exact change and spoke little suggested someone deliberately concealing their identity, but also someone with the confidence and planning to carry out such concealment effectively. As the short winter day faded into evening, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads of evidence and motive that were beginning to weave together into what appeared to be a coherent pattern. The case against Timothy Hartwell was certainly compelling from Inspector Slack's perspective. Clear motive, established opportunity, and behavioral evidence of guilt. Yet something in the careful orchestration of the crime, the symbolic elements and the precise timing suggested a more sophisticated mind at work. The murder of Colonel Weatherby was revealing itself as something more complex than a young man's desperate act. It spoke to years of accumulated resentment, carefully nursed grievances, and the kind of patient planning that comes only with intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and vulnerabilities. Someone had waited for exactly the right moment, chosen exactly the right method, and executed their revenge with a precision that suggested not panic, but cold, calculated justice. The question that would determine the investigation's ultimate direction was whether Inspector Slack's logical progression toward the obvious suspect would prove correct, or whether the real murderer remained hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of innocence, watching the drama unfold while Timothy Hartwell moved inexorably toward the dock. Miss Marple suspected the latter, but proving it would require unraveling not just the mechanics of murder, but the complex emotional landscape of a village where secrets had been allowed to fester far too long beneath the surface of respectability. The morning of December 27th brought Inspector Slack to the police station with the methodical determination of a man who believed his case was approaching its inevitable conclusion. Timothy Hartwell sat across from him in the sparse interview room, his pale face bearing the unmistakable marks of a sleepless night, spent contemplating the narrowing circle of evidence that seemed to point inexorably toward his guilt. The young man's nervous fidgeting and stammered responses to the inspector's measured questions created exactly the impression of consciousness of guilt that satisfied official procedure. The weight of evidence. Inspector Slack had assembled his case with the thoroughness that marked his professional approach. Timothy's gambling debts provided clear motive. His late presence in the village on Christmas Eve established opportunity, and his increasingly erratic behavior suggested the psychological strain of a guilty conscience. The Colonel's letter, discovered in Timothy's pocket, offered compelling evidence of the victim's intention to destroy the young man's future through exposure of his financial difficulties. Yet even as the inspector methodically built his case, troubling details emerged that complicated the seemingly straightforward narrative. The forensic examination of the study's bell pull revealed that the wire had been cut and carefully retwisted, work that required both technical knowledge and steady hands. The precision of the cut, hidden behind the skirting board where casual inspection would miss it, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the house's construction and the patience to execute their plan with meticulous care. More puzzling still was the matter of the tea service itself. Mrs. Crane's testimony placed the preparation of the Colonel's morning tea at 7 o'clock, with delivery at 8:30. Yet Dr. Hartwell's medical examination confirmed that tea left standing for such a period would have developed a distinct skin on its surface, a film entirely absent from the cup found beside the Colonel's body. This suggested that either the poison had been administered much closer to the time of death, or that an entirely fresh cup had been prepared and delivered by someone other than the regular housekeeper. Revelations and complications. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Mrs. Weatherby, her composure finally cracking under the accumulated strain of maintaining appearances, requested a private meeting with Inspector Slack. What emerged from her reluctant testimony painted a far more complex picture of her husband's activities and the web of resentment they had created throughout the village. Colonel Weatherby, it appeared, had been systematically using his position and knowledge to manipulate others for personal gain. His discovery of Dr. Hartwell's irregular medical practices, specifically the unauthorized distribution of controlled substances to patients willing to pay premium prices for discretion, had provided him with leverage that extended far beyond simple financial advantage. The colonel had been forcing the doctor into increasingly compromising positions, including the falsification of medical records and the provision of alibis for questionable activities. This revelation cast Dr. Hartwell's nervous behavior during questioning in an entirely new light. His defensive attitude when Inspector Slack had examined his poison cabinet, his carefully rehearsed account of his movements, and the obvious strain that marked his every interaction with the police all suggested a man with compelling reasons to fear exposure. The doctor's motive for murder was far more substantial than his nephew's gambling debts, involving not merely financial ruin, but professional disgrace and potential criminal prosecution. Miss Marple's quiet observations. While Inspector Slack pursued his methodical investigation, Miss Marple continued her own, patient study of human nature as revealed through domestic details. Her visit to Weatherby House, ostensibly to offer comfort to the bereaved household, provided opportunities to observe the subtle signs that others had overlooked in the immediate drama of official procedure. The kitchen, when examined without the crowd of policemen, revealed telling details about the morning's routine. The sugar tin showed signs of hasty cleaning, with a faint, gritty residue around the rim that suggested unfamiliar handling. More significantly, the silver tongs used for the colonel's customary sugar lump bore traces of recent polishing, an odd detail for a household in mourning, unless someone had felt compelled to remove evidence of their use. Most intriguing to Miss Marple was her observation of the various women's preferences regarding tea preparation. When Margaret Hartwell accepted station tea from a constable, she automatically reached for granulated sugar, adding it with the practiced economy of long habit. When offered lumps from a separate tray, she declined with visible irritation, muttering that lumps never dissolve properly. This seemingly insignificant domestic preference took on greater significance when contrasted with Mrs. Weatherby's careful selection of a single lump, handled with the precise attention that the colonel would have demanded. Village undercurrents. The community's reaction to Timothy's quasi-arrest revealed the complex dynamics that had surrounded the deceased. At the Lamb and Flag, where Timothy sought refuge from mounting pressure, his conversation with the sympathetic landlord, Mr. Giles, provided both insight into his character and additional evidence that complicated the official theory. Timothy's genuine bewilderment at the mention of mistletoe, "I wouldn't have thought of such a thing," suggested either remarkable acting ability or authentic innocence regarding the symbolic elements of the crime. Mr. Giles' casual mention of the mysterious woman in grey gloves who had purchased mistletoe from Mr. Larcher added another layer to the investigation. The description of someone quite particular about her selection, paying with exact change and refusing wrapping paper, painted a picture of deliberate planning rather than spontaneous desperation. This careful preparation seemed inconsistent with Timothy's demonstrated character, which tended toward impulsive self-destruction rather than methodical calculation. The grey gloves mystery. Miss Marple's systematic inquiry into the grey gloves purchase revealed details that further complicated the case against Timothy. Mr. Larcher's expanded description emphasized the elegant quality of the gloves. Fine grey leather, not the sort one usually sees in the village. And the purchaser's deliberate anonymity. Someone had taken considerable care to avoid recognition while acquiring what would prove to be a crucial element in the crime's symbolic presentation. The forensic examination of the study's French doors had revealed smudges consistent with fine leather gloves, supporting the theory of entry through the garden. Yet the careful placement of the mistletoe sprig, with its ironic commentary on Christmas peace and goodwill, suggested a level of psychological sophistication that seemed beyond Timothy's emotional range. The symbolic element spoke to deeper currents of resentment and the kind of bitter poetry that emerges from years of suppressed anger rather than moments of desperate panic. Mounting doubts. As Inspector Slack prepared to formalize charges against Timothy Hartwell, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the investigation was pursuing the wrong suspect. The young man's obvious guilt about something, his gambling debts, his fear of exposure, his general weakness of character, was being misinterpreted as evidence of murder, when it more likely reflected his terror at the Colonel's threats to destroy his future. The real murderer, Miss Marple suspected, remained hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of innocence, watching the drama unfold with the satisfaction of someone whose meticulous planning had successfully deflected suspicion onto a convenient scapegoat. The crime's execution required not merely access and opportunity, but intimate knowledge of household routines, village dynamics, and human psychology, qualities that suggested a far more sophisticated mind than Timothy possessed. The murder of Colonel Weatherby was revealing itself as a masterpiece of misdirection executed by someone who understood that the most effective way to commit the perfect crime was to ensure that someone else appeared perfectly guilty. The challenge now was to pierce through the layers of deception before justice was perverted by the very thoroughness of official procedure, and an innocent man paid the price for another's carefully orchestrated revenge. The investigation had reached a critical juncture where the obvious solution beckoned with seductive simplicity, while the truth remained hidden beneath the surface of village respectability, waiting for someone with Miss Marple's particular gifts to recognize the patterns that others had missed in their eagerness to assign blame and restore order to their disrupted world. The morning of December 28th found Inspector Slack arranging his evidence with the methodical satisfaction of a man whose case was approaching its inevitable conclusion. Timothy Hartwell's formal arrest had brought a sense of order to the investigation, yet even as the inspector prepared his files for the magistrate, troubling details continued to accumulate like snow against a window, individually insignificant but collectively obscuring the view. The weight of physical evidence, Miss Marple's quiet visit to Weatherby House, ostensibly to offer comfort to Mrs. Crane, provided opportunities to observe details that others had dismissed in their eagerness to close the case. The kitchen, when examined without the bustle of official procedure, revealed telling inconsistencies in the established narrative. The sugar tin showed signs of hasty cleaning around its rim, with a faint, gritty residue that suggested unfamiliar handling. More significantly, the silver tongs bore traces of recent polishing, an oddly fastidious touch for a household in mourning. "I always keep the silver bright," Mrs. Crane explained when Miss Marple gently inquired about the gleaming tongs. "But these were polished Christmas morning before I even knew. I noticed because I hadn't touched the silver since Thursday." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Someone had taken considerable care to clean the tongs after their use. Not the action of a panicked young man fleeing the scene, but the methodical behavior of someone who understood the importance of removing evidence. Among the fine spode teacups arranged on the dresser, one stood out for its pristine condition, as if seldom used despite being part of the regular set. The cup that had contained the poisoned tea belonged with the others, yet somehow didn't, a subtle distinction that spoke to careful selection rather than random choice. Revelations and complications. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Dr. Hartwell, his composure finally cracking under accumulated strain, sought out Miss Marple at her cottage. His confession painted a far more complex picture of the Colonel's activities and the web of manipulation they had created throughout the village. For 18 months, Colonel Weatherby had been systematically exploiting his knowledge of the doctor's irregular prescribing practices, forcing him into increasingly compromising positions that extended far beyond simple financial favors. He discovered that I had been providing certain medications to patients who couldn't obtain them through regular channels, Dr. Hartwell admitted, his professional pride warring with desperate honesty. Nothing harmful. Sleeping drafts for elderly ladies whose conditions didn't meet strict criteria, pain relief for laborers who couldn't afford extended treatment, but technically irregular and potentially career-ending if reported to the medical board. This revelation provided a motive far more compelling than Timothy's gambling debts. Dr. Hartwell faced not merely financial ruin, but complete professional destruction, the loss of everything he had worked to achieve over decades of practice. Yet Miss Marple noted that the doctor's distress seemed genuine rather than calculated, the anguish of a trapped man rather than the cold satisfaction of successful revenge. Timeline inconsistencies. A seemingly innocuous conversation with Mrs. Giles at the Lamb and Flag provided Miss Marple with a crucial piece of evidence that undermined the case against Timothy. The landlord's wife, known for her precise memory of her customers' comings and goings, offered a detail that contradicted the established timeline. Young Timothy was here Christmas Eve, looking quite down in the mouth, Mrs. Giles confirmed. But he left well before 10 o'clock, said he had a splitting headache and needed to get home. He certainly wasn't here at 11, not like some folks are saying. This contradicted Timothy's own statement to Inspector Slack, where he had claimed to be out until near 11 o'clock. More significantly, it raised the question of who had actually observed the lights burning in the Colonel's study at that crucial hour. When Miss Marple delicately inquired about this during a visit to the Hartwell residence, Margaret Hartwell provided the answer with telling casualness. Geoffrey was called out to an urgent case that evening, a false alarm in the end, but he was gone for some time, Margaret explained, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. I myself was quite restless, and remember looking out the window around 11, seeing the lights still on at Weatherby House. I wondered what the Colonel could possibly be doing up so late. The Bell Pull mystery. Miss Marple's consultation with Mr. Higgins, the village handyman, revealed technical details that further undermined the case against Timothy. The cut bell pull, so precisely severed and carefully retwisted, required specific skills and tools that the young man simply didn't possess. Not easy to cut cleanly, mind you, Mr. Higgins explained, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Takes proper wire cutters and a steady hand, and to twist it back so neatly. That's the work of someone with experience in electrical wiring or perhaps jewelry repair. Timothy's talents leaned toward charming conversation and losing money at cards, not intricate mechanical work. A panicked youth would likely have yanked the bell pull violently, not performed the careful surgery that had been discovered. This subtle discrepancy, dismissed by the police as a minor detail, resonated deeply with Miss Marple's understanding of human behavior and criminal psychology. An evening of complications. The case took an unexpected turn when Inspector Slack's evening security at Weatherby House was breached with professional efficiency. The theft of the Colonel's dispatch box, executed while a constable stood guard in the hallway, demonstrated a level of planning and nerve that seemed inconsistent with the image of Timothy as a desperate amateur. The thief had known exactly where to find the hidden key, had possessed the tools necessary to slice through official seals, and had moved through the house with the confidence of intimate familiarity. Mrs. Weatherby's revelation that the dispatch box key had been moved to a hollow book after her husband's death raised troubling questions about who possessed such detailed knowledge of the household security arrangements. The careful timing of the theft, occurring just as the case against Timothy was solidifying, suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate misdirection by someone who understood the value of removing potentially incriminating evidence. Margaret Hartwell emerges as Miss Marple pieced together the various elements of motive, opportunity, and method. A clearer picture emerged of the crime's true nature. Margaret Hartwell possessed the medical knowledge necessary to handle poison safely. The domestic expertise to manipulate the tea service without leaving obvious traces, and the intimate familiarity with village routines that would enable her to time the crime perfectly. Her careful attention to detail, evidenced by years of managing a physician's household, would naturally extend to removing evidence and creating plausible alternative explanations for any inconsistencies. The grey gloves mystery resolved itself when considered alongside Margaret's established patterns of behavior. Her preference for quality accessories, her habit of shopping in the county town when she desired anonymity, and her careful attention to appearance all fit perfectly with the description of the mysterious woman who had purchased mistletoe on Christmas Eve. The symbolic placement of that sprig beside the poisoned teacup spoke to the kind of bitter poetry that emerges from years of suppressed resentment, a feminine sensibility rather than masculine desperation. The perfect frame. The murder of Colonel Weatherby was revealing itself as a masterpiece of misdirection, executed by someone who understood that the most effective way to commit the perfect crime was to ensure that someone else appeared perfectly guilty. Margaret Hartwell had constructed her deception with the meticulous care of someone who knew that success required not merely killing her target, but creating an unshakable case against a convenient scapegoat. Every element of the crime, from the unlocked French doors to the carefully timed poison administration, had been designed to deflect suspicion while providing alternative explanations for any inconsistencies that might emerge. The case against Timothy appeared compelling precisely because Margaret had orchestrated it to appear that way, using his genuine guilt about gambling debts and his nervous behavior under questioning to create a narrative that satisfied both official procedure and village expectations. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead and Inspector Slack prepared to formalize charges against Timothy Hartwell, Miss Marple understood that time was running short. The real murderer's perfect crime was approaching its successful conclusion, with an innocent man about to pay the ultimate price for another's carefully planned revenge. The challenge now was to find the crucial piece of evidence that would expose the elaborate deception before justice was perverted by the very thoroughness of official procedure. The peaceful Christmas season had become the backdrop for a crime that revealed the most dangerous aspects of human nature. The capacity for calculated revenge disguised as righteous justice, executed with the domestic skills that society expected women to possess but never suspected they might use for murder. Miss Marple knew that her next moves would determine whether truth would emerge before it was too late, or whether Margaret Hartwell's masterful performance would achieve its intended tragic conclusion. The morning of December 29th brought an unwelcome clarity to Inspector Slack's investigation, like winter sunlight revealing flaws in what had appeared to be perfect crystal. Timothy Hartwell's formal charges were scheduled for the afternoon, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that seemed to fit too neatly into the official narrative. Her long experience with human nature had taught her that real crimes rarely arrange themselves with such convenient precision, and the more she examined the evidence against Timothy, the more convinced she became that someone had orchestrated events with remarkable skill. Domestic revelations. Miss Marple's visit to the Hartwell residence, ostensibly to offer comfort during their family crisis, provided opportunities to observe the subtle details that others had dismissed as insignificant. Margaret received her with the composed grace expected of a physician's wife, but Miss Marple noted how her hostess's hands trembled slightly when handling the delicate china, and how her eyes darted repeatedly to the window as if expecting unwelcome visitors. The sitting room bore the hallmarks of Margaret's meticulous housekeeping, every surface polished to gleaming perfection, every ornament positioned with mathematical precision. Yet it was Margaret's sewing basket that captured Miss Marple's particular attention. Among the orderly reels of thread and bone-headed pins lay a length of green satin ribbon, its end cut with the precise diagonal that indicated recent use. The ribbon's fresh appearance and the careful way it had been coiled suggested it had served some specific purpose within the past few days. Such lovely ribbon. Miss Marple observed gently, her tone carrying nothing more than elderly admiration for domestic crafts. Perfect for Christmas decorations, I should imagine. Margaret's response came perhaps a heartbeat too quickly. Yes, I use it for the surgery's waiting room. Patients appreciate cheerful touches during the holiday season. Her explanation was perfectly reasonable, yet something in her manner suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneous conversation. When Margaret prepared tea, Miss Marple watched with the careful attention she had learned to give to domestic rituals. Without conscious thought, Margaret reached for the granulated sugar, measuring it with the practiced economy of long habit. When Miss Marple gently inquired whether she might prefer lump sugar instead, Margaret declined with visible distaste, murmuring that lumps never dissolve properly. This seemingly trivial preference took on greater significance when Miss Marple recalled that Colonel Weatherby had been particularly fond of lump sugar in his morning tea, a detail that would have required careful consideration by anyone planning to poison his cup. Technical knowledge revealed. Dr. Hartwell's entrance provided Miss Marple with another piece of the puzzle she was patiently assembling. His conversation about household repairs, prompted by her seemingly innocent inquiry about bell pulls, revealed that Margaret possessed far more technical knowledge than most women of her station. She had, it emerged, worked briefly in a London hospital laboratory before her marriage, gaining experience with chemical compounds and precise measurement techniques that would prove invaluable to someone contemplating murder by poison. Margaret has always been remarkably practical, Dr. Hartwell observed with obvious pride. Though his voice carried undertones of strain, she understood the surgery's electrical systems better than I did when we first married. Quite remarkable, really, for someone without formal training. This revelation cast Margaret's domestic competence in an entirely new light. Her ability to manage complex household systems, from plumbing to electrical wiring, would have provided her with the skills necessary to modify the Colonel's bell pull without leaving obvious traces. More significantly, her laboratory background would have taught her to handle dangerous substances with the precision required for successful poisoning. The mistletoe connection. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to Mr. Larcher's shop, ostensibly to purchase winter vegetables, provided another crucial piece of evidence. The greengrocer's expanded recollection of the mysterious woman who had purchased mistletoe on Christmas Eve included a detail that had previously escaped mention: the elegant wooden box she had carried, its carved surface distinctive enough to catch his attention even during the holiday rush. Rather unusual thing to see in the village, Mr. Larcher reflected, his memory sharpened by Miss Marple's gentle encouragement. Looked like something from an antique shop, with intricate patterns carved into the wood. The lady seemed quite particular about it, kept checking that the mistletoe sprig would fit properly inside. This description resonated immediately with Miss Marple's recollection of the carved wooden box she had observed on Margaret Hartwell's mantelpiece. The careful selection of mistletoe that would fit within specific dimensions suggested not casual purchase, but deliberate planning, with the box serving as both transport and storage for what would become a crucial element in the crime's symbolic presentation. Inspector Slack's growing doubts, the accumulation of inconsistencies, began to trouble even Inspector Slack's methodical certainty. The telegram from London regarding Timothy's gambling debts revealed that the financial pressure had been significantly reduced just days before the murder, undermining the immediate desperation that supposedly drove him to kill. More puzzling still was the forensic examination of the study's bell pull, which revealed precision cutting and retwisting that required both specialized tools and steady hands, qualities that seemed inconsistent with Timothy's demonstrated character. When Miss Marple gently shared her observations about domestic details, the polished sugar tongs, the precisely positioned teacup, the symbolic placement of mistletoe, Inspector Slack found himself confronting the uncomfortable possibility that his investigation had been systematically misdirected. The case against Timothy appeared compelling precisely because someone had orchestrated it to appear that way, using the young man's obvious guilt about his gambling as camouflage for a far more sophisticated crime. "The difficulty, Inspector," Miss Marple observed during their private conversation, "is that we have been looking for evidence of panic when we should have been seeking signs of careful planning. This murder was executed with the precision of someone who understood not merely how to kill, but how to ensure that someone else would be blamed for the deed. The dispatch box theft. The theft of Colonel Weatherby's dispatch box, initially dismissed as opportunistic burglary, revealed itself as another element in Margaret's comprehensive plan. The selective removal of specific documents, executed with intimate knowledge of the household security arrangements, suggested someone who knew exactly what evidence needed to be eliminated. The recovered papers painted a picture of systematic blackmail that extended throughout the village, but the missing documents, those relating specifically to Margaret's past, had been removed with surgical precision. Mrs. Weatherby's reluctant admission that only she and Mrs. Crane knew the location of the hidden key provided another thread in the web of evidence pointing toward Margaret's involvement. The doctor's wife had possessed both the knowledge necessary to locate the dispatch box and the technical skills required to breach its security without triggering the alarm system that protected it from casual intrusion. Building toward confrontation. As evening approached and Timothy's formal arraignment drew nearer, Miss Marple understood that time was running short. Margaret Hartwell's masterful deception was approaching its intended conclusion, with an innocent man about to pay the ultimate price for another's carefully planned revenge. The challenge now was to expose the elaborate fraud before legal procedure made correction impossible. Miss Marple's plan crystallized around a simple but effective strategy. She would invite the key players to tea at her cottage, creating an environment where domestic habits and psychological pressures might reveal truths that formal interrogation had failed to uncover. In her long experience, people revealed their true natures most clearly when surrounded by the comfortable rituals of village life, where guard was lowered and authentic responses emerged despite conscious attempts at deception. The invitation, when extended to Inspector Slack, was presented as nothing more than elderly hospitality with a domestic purpose. "I should like to ask a question about tea preparation," she explained with gentle diffidence. "I find that people's preferences in such matters often reveal more about their characters than they realize." The inspector's reluctant agreement reflected both professional courtesy and growing recognition that conventional methods had perhaps missed crucial elements of the case. As Miss Marple prepared for what she knew would be the crucial test of her theory, she reflected on the complex web of deception that Margaret Hartwell had woven with such skill. The murder of Colonel Weatherby represented not merely the elimination of a blackmailer, but a masterpiece of misdirection that had successfully exploited the very thoroughness of official procedure. Tomorrow's tea party would determine whether truth could emerge before justice was perverted by the efficiency of legal process, or whether Margaret's perfect crime would achieve its tragic and irreversible conclusion. The peaceful Christmas season had become the backdrop for a battle between calculated deception and patient observation, with an innocent man's life hanging in the balance. The afternoon of December 29th brought a peculiar quality to the light filtering through Miss Marple's lace curtains, as if the winter sun itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Her cottage, normally a haven of peaceful domesticity, had been transformed into a subtle theater where truth and deception would confront each other across delicate china and carefully arranged refreshments. The guest list was small, but precisely chosen. Inspector Slack, Doctor and Margaret Hartwell, Mrs. Weatherby, and Mrs. Crane, each representing a different thread in the complex tapestry of murder and misdirection that had shattered St. Mary Mead's Christmas peace. The stage carefully set, Miss Marple's preparations revealed the methodical thought she had given to every detail. 2 tea services graced her sitting room table, one featuring her everyday china with granulated sugar in a simple bowl, the other displaying her finest spode cups with lump sugar arranged in a silver service identical to the one used at Weatherby House. The mistletoe from her garden, carefully selected for its perfect white berries and tied with green satin ribbon, provided a seasonal touch that carried deeper significance for those who understood its symbolic importance. Near the sugar service, she had placed a small carved wooden box, its intricate patterns catching the afternoon light. Inspector Slack arrived first, his professional skepticism evident in the way he examined the domestic arrangements with the eye of someone who had learned to distrust coincidences. Dr. Hartwell entered with the careful composure of a man under tremendous strain, his medical training evident in the way he automatically assessed Miss Marple's comfort, even while wrestling with his own family crisis. Margaret followed with the gracious bearing expected of a physician's wife, her appearance immaculate despite recent stress, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her gloved hands and the way her eyes catalogued every detail of the room with unusual intensity. Mrs. Weatherby arrived in her widow's weeds, lending an air of solemn dignity to the gathering, while Mrs. Crane entered last, her usual efficiency somewhat dampened by the weight of recent events. The housekeeper's presence would prove crucial, for her intimate knowledge of household routines provided the foundation upon which Miss Marple's demonstration would rest. The test of preferences. Miss Marple began her experiment with the innocent ritual of serving tea, her movements deliberate as she invited each guest to indicate their preferences. "Now, who takes sugar?" she inquired gently, her gaze lingering thoughtfully on Margaret Hartwell. "I have both lump sugar and granulated, for those who find the lumps troublesome." Dr. Hartwell accepted his cup with absent-minded courtesy, adding a lump of sugar without particular attention. Mrs. Weatherby declined refreshment entirely, citing the inappropriateness of social pleasures during mourning. Margaret's response, however, provided the first crucial piece of evidence in Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated demonstration. When offered her choice between the two sugar services, Margaret reached automatically for the granulated sugar, then caught herself with a slight start. "Granulated, if you please, Miss Marple," she said with perhaps too much emphasis. "Lump sugar can be so terribly inconvenient. Takes an age to dissolve properly, and one is left with those dreadful gritty bits at the bottom." Miss Marple noted this preference with gentle interest, then casually observed that Colonel Weatherby had been particularly fond of lump sugar in his morning tea. Mrs. Crane was most specific about his preferences. One lump, handled with silver tongs, dissolved completely before drinking. Quite particular about it, apparently. The effect was immediate and telling. Margaret's hand tightened involuntarily around her teacup, and a faint flush colored her carefully composed features. Her husband glanced at her with sudden attention, as if recognizing something in her reaction that troubled him. The chemist's revelation. The domestic demonstration was interrupted by a soft tap at the door. A constable entered bearing an envelope with the county stamp, which he handed to Inspector Slack with the embarrassed importance of someone who knows he carries significant news. The inspector slit it open, scanned the contents, and looked up with an expression of grim satisfaction. "The chemist's ledger," he announced, his voice carrying new authority. "In response to my inquiry about recent cyanide purchases. Weatherby House, early December, for wasps' nests. Signed for by—" He paused, his eyes finding the housekeeper. "Mrs. Dorothy Crane." Every gaze turned to Mrs. Crane, who had already gone pale. She shook her head with desperate emphasis, as if trying to dispel a reality that had sprung into the quiet room like a jack-in-the-box. "The Colonel sent me, sir," she whispered, her voice scarcely audible. "He would not trouble himself with such errands." I took the small bottle, as the chemist advised, and gave it into the Colonel's own hands. He put it in the tool cupboard in the scullery and kept the key himself. I never saw it again. This revelation shifted the entire foundation of the investigation. If cyanide had been readily available within Weatherby House itself, Dr. Hartwell's medical supplies were no longer the obvious source. and Timothy's access to poison became far less significant than his accusers had believed. Domestic knowledge as criminal skill. Miss Marple's conversation turned to the broader question of domestic knowledge and its potential applications, her tone remaining conversational while her observations grew increasingly pointed. Such skills must prove invaluable in managing a physician's household, she observed with apparent innocence, addressing Margaret directly. Understanding chemical compounds, precise measurements, even basic electrical repairs, all so practical for someone in your position. Margaret's response revealed the careful preparation she'd given to explaining her background. My laboratory work was quite limited. Basic chemical analysis, nothing more sophisticated than what any competent nurse might learn. Yet when Miss Marple gently inquired about specific compounds, mentioning cyanide's use in certain medical procedures, Margaret's knowledge proved far more extensive than her modest disclaimer suggested. Her detailed explanation of proper handling techniques and safety protocols revealed familiarity that extended well beyond basic nursing training, encompassing the precise measurement skills that would be essential for successful poisoning. The mistletoe gambit, Miss Marple's most crucial test, came when she casually drew attention to the carved wooden box on her table. "A curious little thing from the church jumble," she explained with elderly diffidence. "Mrs. Bartlett insisted I take it, though I can't imagine what one might keep in such a precise container. The lid seems designed for something specific, perhaps mistletoe. One finds that the berries leave such a sticky residue on everything they touch." Margaret's glance fell on the carving with an immediacy that was almost childish in its directness. She recovered quickly, of course, but not before Miss Marple had observed the flash of recognition that crossed her features. The demonstration continued as Miss Marple reached for the mistletoe sprig, handling it with deliberate clumsiness that caused several berries to brush against her sleeve. The sticky threads that clung to the fabric were nearly invisible, but their presence was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to observe. "Such a nuisance, really," Miss Marple murmured, examining the transparent filaments with apparent irritation. "Mistletoe does leave its mark on more than doorways, doesn't it? I imagine anyone handling it would carry traces for some time, particularly on fine leather gloves." The silence that followed carried the weight of recognition and growing fear. Margaret's composure cracked slightly as she realized that her careful symbolic gesture, the mistletoe placed beside the poisoned teacup as bitter commentary on Christmas peace, had become evidence of her guilt through the very substance that made the plant traditionally significant. The bell pull demonstration. Mrs. Crane's presence enabled Miss Marple to conduct a practical demonstration of the Colonel's morning routine. In her small kitchen, the housekeeper recreated the precise ritual of tea preparation with the mechanical efficiency of 11 years' practice. When she reached for sugar, Miss Marple had positioned both granulated and lump varieties equidistantly, claiming confusion about masculine preferences. Without hesitation, Mrs. Crane reached for the silver tongs and selected a single lump, placing it in the cup with the unconscious certainty of long habit. "The Colonel was most particular," she explained. "Always one lump, stirred clockwise 3 times, and the tea must be hot when served." "And if, having prepared tea, the bell were to be pulled?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Crane turned and tugged the fraying cord by Miss Marple's scullery door. The bell jangled thinly in the front room. With the Colonel, one knew to come at once. He disliked waiting. "And if the bell did not sound?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as mild as morning mist. "What would you do if you pulled and no sound came?" "I should suppose the wire had come loose," Mrs. Crane replied immediately. "It happens with house settling. Mr. Higgins fixed it once with a small tool. Mrs. Hartwell has a pair just like it for mending jewelry. Little pliers with a blue nick in the handle." All eyes moved to Margaret, whose carefully maintained composure finally began to show cracks. Her hands, which had been folded neatly in her lap, tightened until the knuckles showed white against her dark gloves. The psychological net closes. The accumulation of evidence, domestic preferences that contradicted the victim's habits, technical knowledge that exceeded claimed experience, possession of tools and materials found at the crime scene, and intimate familiarity with household routines created a web of circumstantial proof that was becoming impossible to explain as coincidence. Inspector Slack's growing conviction that the case against Timothy had been systematically orchestrated brought new urgency to the proceedings. The young man's formal arraignment, scheduled for the following morning, represented a deadline beyond which correction might become impossible. Margaret Hartwell's perfect crime was approaching its moment of ultimate test. Her masterful deception, executed with domestic skills that society expected women to possess but never suspected they might use for murder, faced exposure by someone who understood that the most dangerous criminals often hid behind facades of respectability and competence. As the afternoon light began to fade and the shadows lengthened across Miss Marple's sitting room, the elderly detective prepared for the final phase of her demonstration. The peaceful Christmas season had become the backdrop for a battle between calculated deception and patient observation, with truth and justice hanging in the balance. Margaret's elaborate performance was about to face its ultimate test, and Miss Marple knew that her next words would determine whether an innocent man would pay the price for another's carefully orchestrated revenge, or whether justice would finally illuminate the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface of village respectability. The moment of revelation was at hand, and with it the exposure of a crime that had been planned with the meticulous care of someone who understood that the perfect murder required not just killing the victim, but ensuring that someone else would be blamed for the deed. The sudden silence that followed Mrs. Crane's innocent mention of the pliers with a blue nick in the handle was profound, broken only by the gentle ticking of Miss Marple's mantelpiece clock. Margaret Hartwell's carefully maintained composure, which had weathered every previous revelation with admirable determination, now showed the first genuine crack in its polished surface. Her gloved hands, which had rested so demurely in her lap throughout the afternoon's proceedings, tightened until the fine grey leather stretched taut across her knuckles and a barely perceptible tremor ran through her shoulders. Dr. Hartwell, sensing the subtle shift in atmosphere with the instincts of a man long accustomed to reading human distress, turned to study his wife's profile with growing concern. The accumulation of domestic details that Miss Marple had so patiently catalogued was beginning to form a pattern that even his medical training could not dismiss as mere coincidence. The wooden box, the green ribbon, the technical knowledge, the timeline inconsistencies, each element individually explainable, but collectively painting a picture that filled him with dawning horror. Miss Marple, her keen eyes noting every nuance of the reactions around her, picked up the small carved wooden box from the table with the gentle deliberation of someone handling evidence of profound significance. "Indeed, Mrs. Crane," she murmured, her voice carrying that deceptively mild tone that had become familiar to those who knew her well. Such a specific detail to remember. One does wonder about the particular tools people keep for household repairs. She turned the box over in her weathered hands, allowing the intricate patterns to catch the fading afternoon light. And this little container, quite distinctive, isn't it? Mr. Larcher mentioned seeing one very like it on Christmas Eve, carried by a lady who purchased mistletoe with such particular care. The effect of this observation was immediate and telling. Margaret's breath caught audibly in the quiet room, and her eyes, which had been fixed on the wooden box with uncomfortable intensity, now darted between Mrs. Crane and Inspector Slack as if seeking an escape route from the tightening web of implication. The mistletoe sprig, still resting on Miss Marple's table with its innocent white berries, seemed to mock her with its symbolic significance. Inspector Slack, his professional instincts fully engaged by the subtle dynamics playing out before him, leaned forward with the focused attention of a man who recognized that his investigation had reached its crucial juncture. "Speaking of precision and planning," he said, his tone carrying new authority, "we've made some interesting discoveries about the Colonel's dispatch box." The theft was executed by someone with intimate knowledge of the household's security arrangements, someone who knew exactly where the hidden key was located and which documents needed to be removed. This revelation struck Margaret like a physical blow. The careful control she had maintained throughout the afternoon's questioning finally began to unravel, her face taking on a greenish pallor that spoke to internal distress far beyond mere social embarrassment. Her hands, still encased in those elegant grey gloves, began to tremble with increasing violence, the fine leather no longer able to conceal her mounting agitation. Miss Marple's voice, when she continued, remained as gentle as ever, but her words carried the inexorable weight of accumulated truth. "The difficulty we face," she observed with that apologetic diffidence that made her observations seem like casual conversation rather than devastating accusation, "is that we have been looking at this crime from entirely the wrong perspective. We assumed Colonel Weatherby was killed by someone driven to desperate action by his threats. But what if the murder was committed by someone who had already found a perfect solution to their problem? Someone who killed not from desperation, but from a desire for elegant revenge." The psychological pressure of maintaining her facade while watching these revelations unfold had begun to tell on Margaret's carefully controlled demeanor. Her breathing became labored, each inhalation a visible effort, and her responses to the gentle questioning carried the defensive edge of someone whose elaborate deception was approaching its moment of ultimate test. Dr. Hartwell's growing realization that his wife possessed capabilities he had never suspected brought a new dimension of tragedy to the proceedings. His professional training, which should have enabled him to recognize the signs of calculated deception, had been undermined by years of domestic trust and the comfortable assumption that Margaret's competence extended only to household management. The revelation that she possessed both the technical knowledge and the psychological sophistication necessary for murder shattered not merely his faith in her innocence, but his understanding of their entire marriage. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her tone as conversational as if discussing the weather, "someone with Mrs. Hartwell's background would have understood precisely how to handle dangerous substances safely. Her laboratory experience, far more extensive than she has admitted, provided the expertise necessary to measure poison with lethal accuracy. Her familiarity with household routines, gained through years of managing a physician's domestic arrangements, enabled her to predict the Colonel's movements with mathematical precision." Margaret's facade was crumbling with increasing rapidity now, each revelation stripping away another layer of the careful construction she had built around her guilt. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and dawning recognition, fixed on Miss Marple with the desperate intensity of someone who finally understood the quiet, unassuming woman who had so patiently, so methodically, exposed her elaborate deception. The carved wooden box, the green ribbon cut with diagonal precision, the grey gloves that would have carried traces of mistletoe's sticky residue, the specialized tools necessary for modifying the bell pull. Each piece of evidence spoke to months of careful planning rather than moments of desperate improvisation. The murder of Colonel Weatherby was revealing itself as a masterpiece of misdirection executed by someone who understood that the perfect crime required not merely killing the victim, but ensuring that someone else would be blamed for the deed. Inspector Slack's methodical review of the timeline, guided by Miss Marple's observations, showed how systematically he had been misdirected by someone who understood both police procedure and village psychology with remarkable sophistication. Margaret's claim to have observed lights burning in the Colonel's study at 11 o'clock Christmas Eve was not an alibi, but an admission. She had indeed seen those lights, but from inside the study rather than from her bedroom window. As the short winter day faded into evening and the shadows lengthened across Miss Marple's sitting room, the elderly detective prepared for what she knew would be the final phase of her demonstration. Margaret Hartwell's perfect crime, executed with domestic skills that society expected women to possess but never suspected they might use for murder, faced exposure by someone who understood that the most dangerous criminals often hid behind facades of respectability and competence. The moment of ultimate revelation was approaching, and with it, the collapse of an elaborate deception that had nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent man while allowing the true murderer to escape justice. Margaret's masterful performance was about to face its final test, and the trembling of her gloved hands suggested that even her remarkable self-control had limits that were rapidly being exceeded. The peaceful Christmas season had become the backdrop for a crime that revealed the most calculating aspects of human nature, and Miss Marple's patient observation had penetrated the carefully constructed lies that surrounded Colonel Weatherby's death. The truth, so long hidden beneath the surface of village respectability, was finally emerging into the light, and with it, the promise that justice would triumph over even the most sophisticated deception. The trembling in Margaret's gloved hands had become impossible to ignore, each subtle movement betraying the psychological strain of watching her carefully constructed deception systematically dismantled by Miss Marple's gentle but relentless observations. The afternoon light, filtering through the lace curtains with winter's peculiar clarity, seemed to illuminate every detail of the scene with uncomfortable precision. The carved wooden box, the green satin ribbon, the mistletoe with its innocent white berries that had become symbols of something far more sinister than Christmas tradition. Miss Marple, observing Margaret's distress with the compassionate attention she reserved for human suffering, reached for the mistletoe sprig with movements that appeared casual but carried deeper purpose. "My fingers are not what they were," she murmured apologetically, her voice carrying that deceptively mild tone that had become the instrument of revelation. "Would you be so kind as to help me retie this ribbon? It seems to have come loose, and I do so prefer things to be properly secured." The request appeared innocent enough, the simple appeal of an elderly woman seeking assistance with a domestic task. Yet something in the quality of silence that followed suggested that everyone in the room understood they were witnessing a moment of profound significance. Margaret's eyes fixed on the green satin ribbon with an intensity that spoke to recognition rather than mere courtesy, her breath catching audibly as she realized the trap that had been so carefully laid. With movements that betrayed years of practice despite her visible reluctance, Margaret took the ribbon between her fingers and began to tie it with unconscious precision. Her hands, even trembling as they were, moved with the automatic certainty of someone who had learned to secure knots that would hold under pressure, creating the distinctive double-loop arrangement that spoke to specialized training rather than casual domestic skill. "Such a secure knot," Miss Marple observed with gentle admiration, though her eyes remained fixed on Margaret's technique with uncomfortable intensity. "One rarely sees such precision in village parcels. I believe surgeons use a similar method to ensure proper tension in their work. Something about preventing slippage under stress. Quite beyond my understanding, of course, but I imagine anyone with medical training would find it second nature." The effect of this observation was immediate and devastating. Margaret's hands stilled completely, the ribbon suspended between her fingers as if she had suddenly forgotten how to complete the task. The color drained from her face with startling rapidity, leaving her complexion waxy and unnatural in the afternoon light. Dr. Hartwell, watching his wife's reaction with growing alarm, leaned forward with the instinctive concern of a physician recognizing the signs of severe psychological distress. Inspector Slack, his professional instincts fully engaged by the subtle drama unfolding before him, reached into his pocket with deliberate ceremony and withdrew a small pair of pliers. The tool's blackened jaws and narrow construction spoke to precision work, while a distinctive blue nick in the handle caught the light like an accusation. He placed them on the table between the assembled company with the careful attention of someone presenting crucial evidence. Mr. Higgins identified these as belonging to the Hartwell surgery, the inspector said, his tone carrying new authority as the investigation's focus shifted with mathematical precision. "The blue nick is where they slipped from a nail and caught the grate, quite distinctive according to his account. There's copper residue on the jaws, consistent with the wire used in the Colonel's bell pull system. Rather specialized work, modifying electrical connections without leaving obvious traces of tampering. Margaret's gaze darted to the pliers, and away again with the swiftness of someone recognizing evidence of their own guilt. Her carefully maintained composure, which had weathered every previous revelation with remarkable determination, now showed visible cracks as the web of physical evidence tightened around her with inexorable precision. Miss Marple's voice, when she continued, carried that apologetic diffidence that made her most devastating observations seem like casual conversation. "The difficulty we face," she said with gentle certainty, "is that we have been looking at this crime from entirely the wrong perspective. We assumed Colonel Weatherby was killed by someone driven to desperate action by his threats. But what if the murder was committed by someone who had already found a perfect solution to their problem, someone who killed not from desperation, but from a desire for elegant revenge?" The psychological pressure of maintaining her facade while watching these revelations unfold had begun to tell on Margaret's carefully controlled demeanor. Her breathing became labored, each inhalation a visible effort, and her responses to the gentle questioning carried the defensive edge of someone whose elaborate deception was approaching its moment of ultimate test. "There was another detail that troubled me," Miss Marple continued, her tone as conversational as if discussing the weather. "The teacup found beside the Colonel's body was positioned on the small walnut table by the French doors. An odd place for Mrs. Crane to set one down, since she always uses the proper tray service, but quite convenient for someone entering from the garden who wished to avoid carrying unnecessary items through the house." This revelation struck Margaret with the force of a physical blow. The careful positioning of evidence, which she had thought would support the theory of Timothy's guilt, had instead become proof of her own presence in the study. Her hands, still holding the half-tied ribbon, began to shake with increasing violence as she realized how thoroughly her meticulous planning had been penetrated by someone who understood the significance of domestic details. "The mistletoe itself presents another puzzle," Miss Marple observed, gently taking the sprig from Margaret's nerveless fingers. "Such sticky berries leave traces on whatever they touch, particularly on fine leather gloves. Mr. Larcher mentioned that the lady who purchased mistletoe on Christmas Eve was quite particular about her selection, ensuring it would fit properly in a carved wooden box, very much like this one." Margaret's composure finally began its complete collapse as the full scope of Miss Marple's observations became clear. Every element of her carefully planned crime, from the symbolic placement of mistletoe to the precise timing of the poison administration, had been noted, catalogued, and understood by someone whose lifetime of studying human nature had prepared her to recognize deception in all its sophisticated forms. "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice carrying a tremor that spoke to years of suppressed rage finally finding expression. "None of you understand what it was like to be manipulated by that man, to watch him use people's weaknesses as weapons against them. The Colonel had files on everyone, detailed records of indiscretions, financial irregularities, personal secrets that he used for leverage and control." Dr. Hartwell's face had gone ashen as he listened to his wife's words, the revelation of her involvement striking him with the force of complete betrayal. His hands, trained to steady precision through years of medical practice, trembled as he reached toward her with an instinctive gesture of comfort that stopped halfway, suspended between love and horror at what she had become. Inspector Slack's methodical review of the evidence, guided by Miss Marple's observations, revealed how systematically he had been misdirected by someone who understood both police procedure and village psychology with remarkable sophistication. Margaret's elaborate frame of Timothy Hartwell was not the panicked improvisation of a desperate criminal, but the carefully orchestrated misdirection of someone who had planned every detail with meticulous precision. As the short winter day faded toward evening and the shadows lengthened across Miss Marple's sitting room, the elderly detective understood that Margaret's perfect crime was approaching its final moment of exposure. The peaceful Christmas season had become the backdrop for a battle between calculated deception and patient observation, with truth finally emerging from beneath the layers of respectability and misdirection that had nearly enabled a master criminal to escape justice, while an innocent man paid the ultimate price for her revenge. The revelation was not yet complete, but the foundation had been laid for the final confrontation that would expose every detail of Margaret Hartwell's elaborate deception and ensure that justice would triumph over even the most sophisticated criminal mind. The trembling of her gloved hands suggested that even her remarkable self-control had limits that were rapidly being exceeded, and Miss Marple knew that the moment of complete truth was finally at hand. The trembling in Margaret's gloved hands had become impossible to ignore, each subtle movement betraying the psychological strain of watching her carefully constructed deception systematically dismantled by Miss Marple's gentle but relentless observations. The afternoon light, filtering through the lace curtains with winter's peculiar clarity, seemed to illuminate every detail of the scene with uncomfortable precision. The carved wooden box, the green satin ribbon, the mistletoe with its innocent white berries that had become symbols of something far more sinister than Christmas tradition. Miss Marple, observing Margaret's distress with the compassionate attention she reserved for human suffering, reached for the mistletoe sprig with movements that appeared casual but carried deeper purpose. "My fingers are not what they were," she murmured apologetically, her voice carrying that deceptively mild tone that had become the instrument of revelation. "Would you be so kind as to help me retie this ribbon? It seems to have come loose, and I do so prefer things to be properly secured." The request appeared innocent enough, the simple appeal of an elderly woman seeking assistance with a domestic task. Yet something in the quality of silence that followed suggested that everyone in the room understood they were witnessing a moment of profound significance. Margaret's eyes fixed on the green satin ribbon with an intensity that spoke to recognition rather than mere courtesy, her breath catching audibly as she realized the trap that had been so carefully laid. With movements that betrayed years of practice despite her visible reluctance, Margaret took the ribbon between her fingers and began to tie it with unconscious precision. Her hands, even trembling as they were, moved with the automatic certainty of someone who had learned to secure knots that would hold under pressure, creating the distinctive double-loop arrangement that spoke to specialized training rather than casual domestic skill. "Such a secure knot," Miss Marple observed with gentle admiration, though her eyes remained fixed on Margaret's technique with uncomfortable intensity. "One rarely sees such precision in village parcels. I believe surgeons use a similar method to ensure proper tension in their work. Something about preventing slippage under stress. Quite beyond my understanding, of course, but I imagine anyone with medical training would find it second nature." The effect of this observation was immediate and devastating. Margaret's hands stilled completely, the ribbon suspended between her fingers as if she had suddenly forgotten how to complete the task. The color drained from her face with startling rapidity, leaving her complexion waxy and unnatural in the afternoon light. Dr. Hartwell, watching his wife's reaction with growing alarm, leaned forward with the instinctive concern of a physician recognizing the signs of severe psychological distress. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice carrying decades of shared life now poisoned by dawning suspicion. Miss Marple rose with the tentative dignity of age and moved to the narrow passage where a frayed cord hung beside the scullery door. "Mrs. Crane showed such patience with it earlier," she said conversationally. "When it fails—" She tugged, and the bell made no sound. "One is at quite a loss. Would you humor me, Mrs. Hartwell? Perhaps you might know what causes such difficulties." It was neatly done because it was so ordinary. No challenge, no accusation, merely the familiar problem of a domestic nuisance. Margaret had already risen before she seemed to know she had done so, her body responding to years of competent household management. "It will be the join behind the skirting," she said, the words coming with almost guilty speed. She knelt, gloved fingers tracing the paint-worn edge where wood met plaster, and reached for the precise point at which a hidden wire might be eased and retwisted. For the smallest fraction of time, her hand hovered in the exact place a professional would have indicated. Then she froze, as if a cold draught had blown through the passage and turned her to stone, finally understanding the elegant trap that had been laid for her expertise. Inspector Slack, who had followed without comment, watched the halted movement with an attention that admitted no misunderstanding. From his pocket, he withdrew the small pair of pliers with their distinctive blue nick, placing them on the passage table with deliberate ceremony. "Curious," he observed mildly. "Not the sort of thing most ladies would know at once. Mr. Higgins identified these as belonging to the surgery. Rather specialized work, modifying electrical connections." Margaret rose too quickly, catching at the door frame to steady herself. "Mr. Higgins showed me years ago," she said, and even as she spoke, she heard the hollowness of it. The careful facade she had maintained for months was crumbling with increasing rapidity, each revelation stripping away another layer of the elaborate construction she had built around her guilt. They returned to the sitting room without hurry, as if everyone wished to give propriety one last chance to place itself between them and what must follow. Miss Marple resumed her chair and set the little carved box upon her knee with gentle finality. In the companionable quiet that followed, the clock on the mantel ticked so distinctly that it seemed almost to be keeping count of the distance between pretense and confession. "You don't understand," Margaret said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence like glass shattering. "None of you understand what it was like to be manipulated by that man, to watch him use people's weaknesses as weapons against them." The colonel had files on everyone. Detailed records of indiscretions, financial irregularities, personal secrets that he used for leverage and control. The words poured forth with the desperate relief of someone finally abandoning a burden too heavy to carry. He knew about Geoffrey's prescribing irregularities, about Timothy's debts, about Mrs. Weatherby's family estate issues, even about Mrs. Crane's sister's past. He held us all in his grasp, slowly tightening his hold, enjoying the power. He was going to ruin Geoffrey, expose him, destroy everything we had built. He was going to send Timothy to jail. He enjoyed it. Dr. Hartwell made a small sound that might have been her name or might have been a prayer. He seemed suddenly older, as if a veil had been lifted from a portrait to show not a likeness, but the sitter's secret. The revelation of his wife's capabilities, hidden beneath years of domestic competence, struck him with the force of complete betrayal. Miss Marple's voice, when she continued, carried that apologetic diffidence that made her most devastating observations seem like casual conversation. "The difficulty we face," she said with gentle certainty, "is that we have been looking at this crime from entirely the wrong perspective. We assumed Colonel Weatherby was killed by someone driven to desperate action by his threats. But what if the murder was committed by someone who had already found a perfect solution to their problem? Someone who killed not from desperation, but from a desire for elegant revenge." She picked up the carved wooden box, turning it over in her weathered hands. The planning was indeed remarkable. The careful study of household routines, the acquisition of materials and tools, the precise timing that would ensure Timothy's presence in the village could be used to establish his guilt. You used the colonel's own methods against him, his reliance on routine, his trust in domestic arrangements, his assumption that women were merely efficient servants rather than potential sources of danger. Margaret's laugh carried a bitter edge that spoke to years of suppressed resentment finally finding expression. He never suspected that his housekeeper might observe more than cleaning schedules, or that a physician's wife might possess knowledge extending beyond household management. His arrogance made him blind to the very qualities that made his destruction possible. Miss Marple nodded with something approaching sympathy for the criminal mind's sophistication. "The tea service presented your greatest challenge. Mrs. Crane prepared the colonel's morning tea at 7 o'clock, delivering it at 8:30. But tea left standing for such a period would develop a skin on its surface, yet the cup found beside the colonel's body showed no such film. You prepared a fresh cup using the spirit lamp from the surgery's case, already poisoned with cyanide from the household's own supply, and substituted it for the one Mrs. Crane had left to cool. The systematic reconstruction of the crime's execution continued as Miss Marple revealed how Margaret had exploited her intimate knowledge of village routines and household systems. The modification of the bell pull, executed with precision tools and electrical knowledge that exceeded her claimed abilities, had ensured that the colonel's attempts to summon help would fail at the crucial moment. The careful positioning of the poisoned teacup near the French doors, left unlocked to suggest external intrusion, had been designed to deflect suspicion while providing alternative explanations for any inconsistencies. The mistletoe, Miss Marple observed, gently touching the sprig with its white berries, was perhaps your most elegant touch, a symbol of Christmas peace placed beside the instrument of death. Bitter poetry from someone who understood that even the season of forgiveness has limits. You purchased it on Christmas Eve, transported it in this distinctive carved box, and tied it with green satin ribbon using a surgeon's knot that spoke to medical training. Margaret's composure had finally collapsed completely, her carefully maintained facade replaced by the hollow exhaustion of someone whose elaborate performance had reached its inevitable conclusion. "I killed him," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had finally abandoned pretense. "I planned it for months, studied his routines, learned his weaknesses, and executed what should have been the perfect crime." Inspector Slack rose from his chair with professional gravity, his notebook already in hand. The methodical investigation that had nearly resulted in Timothy's wrongful conviction was finally approaching its correct conclusion, though the revelation brought no satisfaction, only the grim recognition of how thoroughly official procedure had been manipulated by someone who understood both police methods and village psychology. "Mrs. Margaret Hartwell," he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Colonel Reginald Weatherby. You need not say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Margaret offered no resistance, her hands already extended as if she had been waiting for this moment since Christmas morning. The elaborate deception that had sustained her through months of planning and execution had finally been exposed by someone whose lifetime of studying human nature had prepared her to recognize calculated revenge disguised as righteous justice. As the constable gently led Margaret away, Dr. Hartwell remained seated, his professional composure finally shattered by the revelation of his wife's true capabilities. The woman he had lived with for decades had revealed herself to be someone entirely different, not merely capable of murder, but of the sophisticated planning and psychological manipulation required to nearly achieve the perfect crime. Miss Marple, gathering the scattered evidence of the afternoon's revelation, reflected on the complex web of deception that had nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent man while allowing a master criminal to escape justice. The peaceful Christmas season had become the backdrop for a crime that revealed the most calculating aspects of human nature, executed by someone whose domestic skills and social position had provided both the means and the camouflage necessary for sophisticated murder. Outside, snow began to fall again with the softness of a world that forgets quickly. Inside, the clock ticked on, marking the interval between what had been believed and what would now have to be lived. The village of St. Mary Mead would wake tomorrow to astonishing news, the comfortable narrative of Timothy Hartwell's guilt shattered and replaced by the far more unsettling truth of Margaret Hartwell's calculated revenge. The truth, so long hidden beneath the surface of village respectability, had finally emerged through patient observation and understanding of human nature in all its dangerous complexity. Miss Marple, ever composed, reflected on the enduring lesson that even in the quietest corners of England, the human heart could harbor darkness as profound as any city slum, and that the most dangerous secrets were often those hidden in plain sight, behind the most respectable of facades. The Christmas peace, once broken, had been restored, but the memory of that silent Christmas morning would forever carry an air of unease. A reminder that beneath the comforting routines of domestic life lay the eternal capacity for both great good and terrible evil that defined the endless complexity of human nature. The quiet click of the closing door after the constable led Margaret Hartwell away seemed to reverberate through Miss Marple's small sitting room, leaving behind a silence far heavier than the gentle ticking of her mantelpiece clock. Dr. Hartwell remained slumped in his chair, his professional composure finally shattered by the revelation of his wife's true capabilities. The man who, had entered with the careful dignity of a respected physician now looked as though every foundation of his existence had crumbled, his hands trembling as he struggled to reconcile the woman he had lived with for decades with the master criminal who had nearly achieved the perfect crime. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap that seemed to punctuate the end of an arduous chapter. "Timothy Hartwell will be released immediately, of course," he announced, his tone carrying both relief and grudging admiration for Miss Marple's methods. "A narrow escape for the lad, thanks to your observations." Miss Marple merely offered a gentle smile, her blue eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime studying human nature in all its dangerous complexity. The most dangerous criminals, Inspector, are often those who understand how to use society's very assumptions against it. Margaret was not a woman of impulsive violence, but of meticulous planning. Her domestic skills provided perfect camouflage for capabilities that extended far beyond household management. The village awakens. To truth. By morning, news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the inexorable efficiency of village gossip, though this time the comfortable narrative of Timothy's guilt was replaced by something far more unsettling. At the post office, Mrs. Pratt found herself obliged to dismantle her carefully constructed theories about the young man's wickedness, replacing them with the disturbing realization that domestic competence could conceal criminal sophistication. Timothy himself appeared at his uncle's surgery before breakfast, pale and hollow-eyed, but carrying himself with the dignity of someone who had faced the worst and survived. His confession came in a rush. The gambling debts, the London friends, the foolish pride that had nearly cost him everything. Dr. Hartwell listened with the patience of a man who had learned that truth, however painful, was the only foundation upon which trust could be rebuilt. "We shall make a proper accounting with Mr. Petherick," the doctor said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that redemption required action rather than mere words. "There will be work to be done, debts to be paid, and habits to be changed. But it can be managed, Timothy, if you're willing to do what's necessary." Revelations and reconciliations. The afternoon brought Mr. Petherick with his leather portfolio and news that cast Margaret's crime in an even more tragic light. Colonel Weatherby's intended will changes, scheduled for discussion after Boxing Day, revealed not vindictive disinheritance but practical provisions, a modest trust for Timothy to be administered until he proved himself steady, proper arrangements for Mrs. Crane and various charities, and careful provisions for Mrs. Weatherby's future security. The old tyrant intended in his iron way to rescue what he could, Miss Marple observed, with something approaching sadness. Margaret killed a man who might, at last, have chosen mercy over manipulation. She could not have known, of course, but it adds a particular poignancy to the tragedy. Dr. Hartwell's decision to write voluntarily to the medical board about his prescribing irregularities brought its own form of resolution. Whatever consequences followed, he would face them honestly, having learned that integrity, once compromised, could only be restored through complete transparency. The village adjusts. St. Mary Mead possessed the particular resilience of small communities that have weathered countless storms of scandal and revelation. The comfortable routines of daily life, the morning post, the afternoon tea, the evening bells, provided a framework within which even the most shocking truths could eventually be absorbed and processed. Mrs. Weatherby, freed from decades of careful management of her husband's difficult temperament, began to discover what her own preferences might be. Her request for Miss Marple's advice on selecting a practical carpet for the morning room spoke to the quiet domestic concerns that would shape her new independence. Mrs. Crane, initially devastated by the revelation that she had been unwittingly used in Margaret's elaborate deception, found comfort in Mrs. Weatherby's invitation to remain as housekeeper. The two women, both survivors of the Colonel's dominating presence, began to forge a household based on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy. Miss Marple's Reflections. As winter deepened and the village settled into its post-Christmas rhythms, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of deception that had been so carefully woven and so patiently unraveled. Margaret Hartwell's crime represented something more sophisticated than simple murder. It was a masterpiece of misdirection that had exploited every assumption about gender, respectability, and domestic competence that society held dear. The carved wooden box now sat quietly on Miss Marple's mantelpiece, its criminal career ended, returned to the innocent purpose of storing sewing supplies. The green satin ribbon had been carefully smoothed and wound onto a card, because even ribbon that had served dark purposes could be redeemed for honest use. The mistletoe, however, had been consigned to the garden compost heap, where it would enrich next year's soil rather than hang over doorways as a symbol of peace and goodwill. The enduring lessons. On New Year's Eve, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, listening to the distant sound of church bells marking the passage from one year to the next, she considered the enduring lessons of the Christmas murder that had shattered St. Mary Mead's peace. Human nature, in all its dangerous complexity, remained as unpredictable as ever, capable of both remarkable goodness and calculated evil, often hidden behind the most respectable facades. The case had revealed that the most dangerous criminals were not always the desperate amateurs who left obvious clues, but the sophisticated planners who understood that the perfect crime required not merely killing the victim, but ensuring that someone else would be blamed for the deed. Margaret's elaborate performance had nearly succeeded because it exploited the very thoroughness of official procedure and the comfortable prejudices of village life. Yet it had also demonstrated that patient observation and understanding of human nature could penetrate even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The small domestic details, preferences for sugar, techniques for tying knots, knowledge of household systems, had ultimately proved more revealing than any amount of physical evidence or formal interrogation. As the clock struck midnight and St. Mary Mead entered the new year, Miss Marple understood that the peaceful rhythms of village life would continue, marked by the eternal cycle of human folly and redemption, secrets and revelations, crimes and justice. The Christmas season, with its promise of peace and goodwill, would return, carrying both hope and the quiet recognition that beneath the surface of the most respectable communities lay the endless complexity of human nature, requiring constant vigilance and the kind of patient wisdom that came only from a lifetime of watching, listening, and understanding the intricate patterns by which people revealed their true selves. The murder on that silent Christmas morning had been solved, justice had been served, and St. Mary Mead had learned once again that the price of peace was eternal attention to the small details of human behavior that revealed the difference between innocence and guilt, between genuine virtue and carefully constructed deception. In the end, it was perhaps the most valuable lesson of all, that truth, however carefully hidden, would eventually emerge for those with the patience and wisdom to recognize it when it appeared. The first week of January arrived with a thaw that seemed to mirror the village's gradual release from the grip of recent events. Snow retreated from hedgerows and roofed lines, revealing the familiar contours of St. Mary Mead beneath winter's fading shroud. The comfortable rhythms of daily life, the morning post, the afternoon shopping, The evening conversations at garden gates provided a framework within which even the most shocking revelations could eventually be absorbed and processed by a community that had weathered countless storms over the centuries. Justice and redemption take their course. News from the county courthouse arrived with Inspector Slack's morning visit to Miss Marple's cottage, where he found her tending to early bulbs in her conservatory. Margaret Hartwell had been remanded without drama. Her composure returned as if she had found relief in the firmness of official procedure. The inspector, accepting tea with the careful politeness of a man who had learned respect for domestic wisdom, admitted that the case would proceed without complication. The physical evidence, the chemist's records, the tool marks on the bell pull, the traces of mistletoe residue on gloves recovered from the Hartwell house, lay precisely where Miss Marple had indicated it would be found. "I nearly sent an innocent man to the dock," Inspector Slack confessed, his usual professional certainty tempered by uncomfortable reflection. "Your observations about domestic details proved more reliable than all our formal procedures combined." Miss Marple offered him another cup with gentle understanding. "The difficulty, Inspector, is that we so often see what we expect to see, particularly when dealing with people whose social positions encourage certain assumptions about their characters and capabilities." Timothy Hartwell's transformation from suspected murderer to chastened nephew provided one of the most heartening aspects of the entire tragic affair. His work at the surgery, previously casual and somewhat reluctant, now carried the intensity of someone who understood that second chances were precious gifts not to be squandered. The gambling debts that had seemed so insurmountable were being addressed through a combination of his uncle's assistance and his own determined efforts to prove himself worthy of trust. When he visited Miss Marple to express his gratitude, bringing with him a dog-eared medical text and news of a case where he had been, he said with wonder, genuinely helpful, she recognized the profound change that near catastrophe could sometimes work in young hearts. Dr. Hartwell's decision to face the medical board with complete honesty brought its own form of resolution. His letter, written with the careful precision of someone who understood that redemption required absolute transparency, detailed not only his unauthorized prescribing practices, but the systematic blackmail that had made his position increasingly untenable. The board's response proved more understanding than he had dared hope, a formal reprimand and period of supervision rather than the complete destruction of his career that he had feared. St. Mary Mead, with the particular forgiveness of small communities toward those who seek genuine redemption, began to observe his earlier hours, longer walks, and renewed dedication to forgotten cases with cautious approval. Household transformations. Mrs. Weatherby's gradual emergence from the shadow of her husband's dominating personality provided perhaps the most positive outcome of the entire affair. Her tentative experiments with independence, choosing her own morning routine, rearranging furniture to suit her preferences, entertaining visitors according to her own inclinations, revealed a woman of considerable intelligence who had been systematically diminished by years of psychological manipulation. The friendship that developed between Mrs. Weatherby and Mrs. Crane demonstrated how tragedy could sometimes create unexpected bonds. The two women, both survivors of the Colonel's systematic control, found in each other the understanding that comes only from shared experience of particular forms of suffering. Mrs. Crane's decision to remain as housekeeper, now in a relationship based on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy, provided security for both women as they navigated their new circumstances. The question of what to do with the Colonel's extensive files, those detailed records of village indiscretions that had provided him with such devastating leverage, was resolved with characteristic practicality. Mrs. Weatherby, after Mr. Petherick had secured what the law required, consigned the remainder to a bonfire in the morning-room grate. "It is not that I forgive him," she explained to Miss Marple during a quiet afternoon visit, "but I will not allow him to continue doing harm when he is not here to enjoy it." The will's surprising provisions. When Colonel Weatherby's will was finally read, it proved as unexpected as it was revealing. Far from the vindictive document that many had anticipated, it showed careful provision for those who had served him faithfully and practical arrangements for the village's welfare. A trust for Timothy, to be increased upon proof of steadiness, a substantial gratuity for Mrs. Crane, sufficient to give her choices she had never enjoyed. Charitable bequests that reflected a military man's understanding of waste and necessity. The old tyrant intended, in his iron way, to rescue what he could, Miss Marple observed to Mr. Petherick during one of their regular conversations. Margaret killed a man who might at last have chosen mercy over manipulation. She could not have known, of course, but it adds a particular poignancy to the tragedy. Symbolic resolutions. The physical remnants of the crime found their own quiet conclusions. The carved wooden box, its criminal career ended, returned to innocent purpose on Miss Marple's mantelpiece, where it held her thimble and spare buttons with unremarkable domesticity. The green satin ribbon, carefully smoothed and wound onto a card, awaited future use in honest household tasks. The mistletoe, however, had been consigned to the garden compost heap, where it would enrich next year's soil rather than hang over doorways as a symbol of peace and goodwill that had been so tragically perverted. Village memory and wisdom. As winter deepened and then began its slow retreat toward spring, St. Mary Mead settled into rhythms that were familiar yet subtly altered by the events of that silent Christmas morning. The comfortable assumptions about respectability and social position that had governed village life for generations had been permanently modified by the recognition that the most dangerous secrets were often those hidden in plain sight, behind the most impeccable facades. At the post office, Mrs. Pratt had adapted her theories with the gracious efficiency of someone who understood that village authority required flexibility. Her conversations now carried a new awareness of the potential complexities hidden beneath domestic competence, though she was careful not to let suspicion poison the ordinary courtesies that made community life possible. The church bells that had called the faithful to worship on Christmas morning continued to mark the passage of time with ancient authority, but their sound now carried undertones of remembrance for those who understood that even the most peaceful communities could harbor darkness as profound as any urban nightmare. Miss Marple's enduring observations. On quiet evenings by her fire, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lessons of the Christmas murder that had shattered St. Mary Mead's peace. The case had reinforced her lifelong understanding that human nature remained as complex and unpredictable as ever, capable of both remarkable goodness and sophisticated evil, often concealed behind the most respectable appearances. Margaret Hartwell's crime had represented something more dangerous than simple murder. It was a masterpiece of misdirection that exploited society's assumptions about gender, respectability, and domestic competence. The most chilling aspect was not the poison itself, but the meticulous planning that had nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent man while allowing the true murderer to escape justice. Yet the case had also demonstrated that patient observation and understanding of human nature could penetrate even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The small domestic details, preferences for sugar, techniques for tying knots, knowledge of household systems, had ultimately proved more revealing than any amount of physical evidence or formal interrogation. As spring approached and the first tentative buds appeared on her garden's bare branches, Miss Marple understood that the peaceful rhythms of village life would continue, marked by the eternal cycle of human folly and redemption, secrets and revelations, crimes and justice. The Christmas season would return with its promise of peace and goodwill, carrying both hope and the quiet recognition that beneath the surface of even the most respectable communities lay the endless complexity of human nature. The murder on that silent Christmas morning had become part of St. Mary Mead's collective memory, a reminder that the price of peace was eternal attention to the small details of human behavior that revealed the difference between genuine virtue and carefully constructed deception. In the end, Perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all, that truth, however carefully hidden, would eventually emerge for those with the patience and wisdom to recognize it when it appeared. The village would remember Margaret Hartwell not as the competent physician's wife they had thought they knew, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and the necessity of looking beyond surface respectability to the human heart beneath. And in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple would continue her patient observation of human nature in all its domestic manifestations, ready to recognize the patterns that others missed, should such recognition ever again be needed to prevent the triumph of calculated evil over simple justice. The Christmas bells would ring again, the mistletoe would hang in doorways, and the comfortable routines of village life would continue. But St. Mary Mead would never again be quite so innocent in its assumptions about the capabilities hidden beneath the most ordinary facades, and perhaps that knowledge, however uncomfortable, was itself a form of protection against the sophisticated deceptions that could flourish in the quiet corners where respectability provided perfect camouflage for the most dangerous intentions.